Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this finalist open forum for the UCF's next Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning and Dean of the College of Undergraduate Studies. I'm Barry Hoffman-Ruddy. I'm representing the Faculty Senate today, and very happy to introduce Dr. Ravi Krovi. Dr. Krovi is a professor of management and information systems at the University of Akron, where his leadership experience included a decade as Dean of the College of Business Administration. He has a PhD in Management Information Systems and Decision Sciences, a master's degree with specializations in computer science and statistics from the University of Memphis, and his bachelor's of engineering from the University of Baroda, India. He has published extensively in academic journals and invited extensively as a guest speaker for national and international conferences. Dr. Krovi will present and then answer some questions from the audience, and you can learn more about his qualifications and background from the newsroom section of the Provost website. Let's give Dr. Krovi a big welcome. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Barry. Good afternoon, everyone. I think I've got my slides here. Okay. I feel like I'm teaching all those unpopular classes. I've got everybody on that side and in the back. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've had great discussions the whole morning with your colleagues from the Provost's office, some of the vice presidents, and then later on with the search committee as well. Really excited about being at the University of Central Florida and looking forward to presenting my thoughts and have a discussion with you about student success as well. Just wanted to tell you that my journey with student success started about 10 years ago when I became the dean of the College of Business at the University of Akron. And when around that time, we were just going through the financial crisis, and we had a very significant drop in enrollment. And one of the things we had to do was develop a student success strategy. So I'm hoping to talk to you a little bit about what we did in terms of retention, degree completion, post-graduation outcomes, and so on. The other thing is that my experience is also informed from a consumer perspective. Both my daughters attended Ohio State University. It's a very big school, not as big as UCF, but nevertheless right up there. And so I have a nuanced view from the standpoint of some of the pressure points, if you may, from being at a large metropolitan public research institution. So let's go ahead and move forward. Just to give you some perspective, just to give an outline, I'm going to talk a little bit about higher education pressure points, just to set the context, talk a little bit more about degree completion and learning outcomes, what's the state of thinking, current state of thinking in that, and then pivot to talking about student success strategies that we used at the University of Akron. And specifically, I'll talk about how we improved our retention rate, how we improved our four-year graduation rate, how we had increases in our placement rate, and so on. I'll also talk a little bit about our EDGE program, which is actually a professional development program where we implemented a lot of these high-impact practices. And so we'll talk about that. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges facing your institution, at least my perspective on that, and then open it up for discussion, and so hopefully we can have some good discussion after that. So, if there is one word to summarize higher education, I think the best word would be hyper-competitive. And so there are many players. Technology is a great disruptor. The market is very fragmented, and all this is happening in an environment of state and federal research cuts. And so, a lot of institutions are grappling with how do they reposition themselves in this new environment, because clearly it is evident that you cannot be everything to everyone. So what is your brand, and how do you position yourself so you can compete much more successfully? The other thing is that there is significant concern about students and student outcomes. And this sort of goes to really the presentation I'm going to give today. I'm going to talk a little bit about completion rates and achievement gaps, talk a little bit about also student outcomes. What do we expect students to know when they graduate? What are the skill sets, the knowledge, skills, and abilities for a college graduate, and what does that mean? So we talk a little bit about student success, and usually, if you have you seen any of those word clouds on student success? They have at least 100 words, right? And that's because everybody has their own perspective about student success. For some people, student success is all about access. For some people, student success is all about retention, and so on and so forth. What I wanted to do really was to give you my perspective about student success. The two things which I think are very critical. One, to me, is timely degree completion. And in that is included access, retention, and graduation. And I think the other side of the student success coin, honestly, is all about academic preparation. What are the learning outcomes for students when they graduate? What do we expect a college graduate to know? And what do we expect a college graduate to be able to do? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about some of the research from the American Association of Colleges and Universities in terms of how they've defined learning outcomes. I'll also review a survey of employers in terms of what skills they're looking for. So let's talk about degree completion. So the national stats on degree completion are not very encouraging. The 6-year placement rate is about 60%. Not placement rate, I'm sorry, completion rate is about 60%. And the other stat, which to me is really stunning, is that since 1980, only half of the students who attended college have graduated. I'll just let that sink a little bit. Only half of the students who graduated who went to college have graduated. It's kind of interesting because, I think, we talk a lot about the student debt and student debt crisis, but like Michael Crow, the president of Arizona State, he talks about this and he says, it's not just a debt crisis, we have a completion crisis. So, the challenge is how do you get students to complete? So when you start thinking about this, what is it that causes some students to be able to complete successfully in 4 or 6 years and causes others to just, fail out, right? So if you look at some of the research, which really talks about fundamentally what influences student success, what are the determinants of student success. One of the key determinants is pre-college experiences, their academic preparation before they come to college, their financial and economic constraints, and while they're here, there are other behaviors which matter, the level of motivation for a student, the amount of interaction they have with a faculty member. And there are institutional aspects also, the degree of support, academic advising, instructional support for that student. Looks like I've lost the slides.
Yeah, they're back.
Oh, they're back, sorry, okay. I've lost the slide, okay. So, I think in general, when you start thinking about this, it is interesting because the question is, how do you get students to complete? And, these completion rates are even more dicey when you look at risk groups. So, for example, the achievement gaps, the significant achievement gaps between underrepresented segments and the actual rate of 60%. So if you're thinking about, like, for example, the University of Central Florida has transfer students. There are significant achievement gaps between FTIC and transfer students. So the challenge is how do you reconcile these gaps? And this is becoming even more important because the student of today is a non-traditional student typically. And some of the numbers I'm going to share with you here, 26%, 1 in 4 work full-time, meaning they're actually working full-time and they're taking a full load at the university. That's a pretty big schedule, right? So a lot of these students are coming in, they're cobbling together about 4 hours, finishing up their classes, and they're gone, right? And so they're not able to attend any of those special purpose programs you're offering that afternoon or that evening. So I think one of the key questions is how can you redesign institutions to meet the needs of not just the traditional students, but also meet the needs of non-traditional students. And when you start looking at demographic shifts, some of the demographic projections have shown that there's going to be a significant drop in the number of high school graduates in the Midwest and the Northeast, but that will increase in the Western region, the Southern region. But most of that increase will be, again, with 2 at-risk groups, typically first-generation Hispanic students as well as low-income students as well. So this problem is really not going away. The question is, how does the institution restructure itself and have an infrastructure to support the needs of these non-traditional students? There's also research which has shown that high-impact practices can benefit students. There's a lot of correlation with gains in learning outcomes, personal development, and deep learning. And historically, underserved students also benefit from these practices, high-impact practices. In fact, some of the evidence has also shown that doing at least more than one, at least 2 or 3 multiple high-impact practices can have cumulative additive effects. And I think having a high-impact practice, like one of the things that's happening at Ohio State is they have a scholars program. So basically what you're doing is that you have a cohort, and if a student is associated with that cohort, that works very well because that's their network, that's their group of study, right? So you effectively shrunk a 60,000 institution to about 30 or 40 students. So there are a lot of these good practices. The challenge with high impact practices is, number one, that they are costly. They're not scalable. So for example, if you think about undergraduate research, right, there are only so many faculty, and you've got all these students. So you have to be creative in how you implement these high impact practices. I think the other thing is that designing and developing high impact practices and really including them in your curriculum is not part of the typical reward system for faculty. So I think that's another aspect which gets missed quite often. And I think there's also no way to track the long-term impact of high-impact practices, because they're not measurable, they're not tracked by iPads and those kinds of databases, because they're not in a transcript, right? They're just co-curricular. So I think one of the long-term challenges is really how do you figure out the impact of these high-impact practices? So let me talk a little bit about the other side of the student success coin, which is all about learning outcomes. And we were talking about this earlier. Really, if you think about what is happening from a industry perspective, we're on the verge of a fairly significant technology revolution. You got all these technologies related to robotics, automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on. And that's fundamentally transforming businesses and business models. So the expectation from an employer perspective is no longer just transactional skills. What they're looking for are skills which are more to do with high-order thinking. So there is a lot of discussion about what should a college student know and what should a college student be able to do. And when you look at some of the data from employers, from the C-suite, you can see that there are two data points there. Number one is, on the right side, is how important is that quality, and the number on the left is rating current college graduates. And you see the biggest delta is with the first 5 or 6, literally, critical thinking, application of knowledge skills, communication, oral and written communication, teamwork, ability to work independently, as well as ethical judgment. So the challenge is that really, how do you infuse this into your curriculum? How do you make sure that every student is getting this? So the ASCSU, not CSU, ASCU, is the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and they came up with the framework. They actually they took this on and they defined what they call as the liberal education America's Promise kind of recommendation. And what they came up with was a set of learning outcomes. And in that, they talked about the key knowledge elements of what every college graduate needs to know, and what are the skills that they need to bring when they graduate from an employer perspective. Now, they purposely called it liberal education because the point they were making is that it's not just liberal arts. It applies to all disciplines. It applies to the professional disciplines like business, engineering, health. It also applies to the sciences, technology, as well as the arts. So the other thing is that they essentially they said that it's not just part of the gen ed, it's also how you infuse it throughout the curriculum. So when you start thinking in terms of specific skill sets, intellectual and practical skills like inquiry and analysis, quantitative literacy, information literacy. These are all things which are not necessarily taught. They need to be practiced. And they need to be practiced throughout the curriculum. How you do it is through the use of these high-impact practices. And I know UCF is doing a lot of these integrative applied courses. So that's one of the things in terms of increasing the the number of HIPs, the high-impact practices in your curriculum. So let me talk a little bit about student success strategy at the University of Akron. As I was mentioning earlier, that one of the biggest challenges we had was a drop in enrollment. So we were trying to figure out how to reposition ourselves from a market differentiation perspective. How can we be competitive in this market? The other thing that changed for us was the Ohio funding formula, which is now certainly based on learning outcomes, retention, degree completion, and other things. So as we started doing this, we started thinking about what is the best way we can meet the needs of our student. This gives you an idea of a student profile, which is not completely different from what you have at UCF. We have a large percentage of students who are Pell Grant eligible, a lot of first-generation students. We have quite a few transfer students as well. And so the challenge was, how do you develop a strategy which repositions the business school? So what we did was we came up with these 3 strategic pillars. And we called it career readiness. That was sort of our career ready and connected was our whole mantra. And it was based on academic quality in the curriculum, experiential learning, bringing in more real-world cases and projects into the curriculum, and also adding more professional development within the curriculum as well. In addition to this, we also had a fairly significant number of initiatives for degree completion and retention. And I'm not going to go through all of those, but let me speak to a few of these. Like, for example, the freshman year, we had an initiative called Real People and Real Careers. And one of the reasons we wanted to offer this initiative was to really decrease the number of undecided students, trying to make sure that they picked a major as quickly as possible, as opposed to being an undecided in business. The other one, if I can use the pointer here, right, is finish in time. Is we're trying to promote the balance between the load you have in school and the load you have at work. Working. So the 15 stands for 15 student credit hours, and the other 15 stands for the number of hours you've worked. And I think it was kind of an interesting thing because we promoted that to show the loss of potential income by graduating later. And so I think that was very impactful as well. Talking a little bit about, we had other strategies like Coach and Connect mentoring, where we paired them up with a lot of the business professionals from our advisory boards. And we also had another strategy called Murky Middle, which was really addressing a group of students who are neither here nor there. I mean, these are students who typically are between 2.5 and 3.0 GPA. And so the question was, how can we bring them back? And so there was a lot of intrusive advising with them, trying to get them connected with our professional development programs, or doing advising with them so that they would have different behaviors. And I think the last one right here is high. We looked at some of our courses which had high rates of withdrawal, drops, and failures. So like one of the courses was the transition from Accounting Principles 1 to Accounting Principles 2. And looking at the data, I think a lot of our faculty came up with ways to actually reduce that from a 35% to almost 15%. So we were able to shave that off by 20 percent points. And I think similarly with economics, micro and macro, we were able to redesign the structure of those courses so that we could reduce the number of withdrawals and drops. From the standpoint of high impact practices, we had professional development programming as well as academic high touch experiences, and most of the academic high touch experiences were projects, capstone projects, senior innovation project, and interdisciplinary collaborations. But what I wanted to really talk about is the professional development program. And what we did was we developed a program which was wrapped around competencies of leadership, global fluency, collaboration, critical thinking, and so on. And the idea was to get students involved in these programs, and we started offering as an incentive points to participate in this program. We recently bought a software package to actually track the number of points. And when you accumulate a certain number of points, you get this EDGE honors medal at the end of the program. But it was a pretty cool thing to do because I think it actually helped us with the overall placement rate. It helped a lot of our students get internships. And it's a unique way to position yourself as a differentiator from a lot of the other business schools. So the professional development program, we started this in 2012 with our Institute for Leadership Advancement, and it's now fairly significant part of the College of Business. So let me talk a little bit about UCF and some of the issues that you're facing. And this is just my read based on what I have seen on your website and what I was able to glean in my conversations with the search committee. I think there's a clear focus, on the state performance and preeminence metrics. You've really, I think your 6-year placement rate, you met that goal. You met the goal for the retention rate. Your biggest challenge is the 4-year completion rate, 4-year degree completion rate. And so I think one of the strategies is how do you figure that? How do you increase the 4-year degree completion rate? The other thing I would say, which is not as much of a big issue, is really I think the overall placement rate is like 60 to 65%. And I think, if you can move that, I think that'll certainly help. So that's one thing. I think the achievement gaps between transfer students and first time in college certainly is a challenge. Increasing the number of high impact practices, both from a student perspective, so you have more students participating, as well as from a faculty perspective, really certainly helps, will be very useful. And overall, I think the big challenge is how do you maintain scale, manage scale, and maintain quality. And I think, to me, I think this is a problem that, I think the animations are not working. But to me, I think this is a problem which a lot of institutions, especially like UCF, are facing, public, research, urban universities. And when you start thinking about this, how does an institution adjust its business model from one which is predicated on economies of scale and modify it to a business model and a value proposition that is driven by mass customization? The question is, how can you offer a distinctive, personalized experience for every student? And how can you do that in a cost-effective manner? And the second question is, how can you make sure that your non-traditional students, who are typically, don't take, how can you make sure your non-traditional students avail themselves of all these great co-curricular activities and the high-impact practices that you have on your campus? And when you start thinking about this and you look at the scale, there is, obviously UCF is a part of the University Innovation Alliance, and you look at some of the schools which have implemented these programs, like Georgia State has a great Math Emporium program. Arizona State has done a lot of work in adaptive learning software, and Ohio State with the Scholars Program and so on. So there is a sense of how can we collaborate with other institutions to learn more about these best practices. But the challenge remains, how do you scale, some of these programs? You have 69,000 students. How can you develop programs so that every student has a touch point? Okay. Just a couple of final slides here. One is on change management, and this one's, how do you increase student participation, right? I think somewhat like your, what we did with EDGE, where we gave points, and I think it's sort of similar to, you have a program called Knights of Distinction. Lost the slide again. So I'll keep talking. You have a program called Knights of Distinction. And I think the question is, how do you get students to participate in these co-curricular programs? But I think the other side is also, how do you manage program creep? You talk to students, and some of them will tell you that they're double majoring and doing a triple minor. That has to take more than 4 years, right? So, how do you manage program creep? I think that's the other side of the coin, really. While we encourage students to be more interdisciplinary, I think we have to be careful in terms of how much it impacts their graduation rate. I think faculty support and participation is absolutely critical. And I think part of this job is to help faculty understand the challenges that students face, help them, understand those challenges, but also have some culture of inclusion, create a culture of inclusion and empathy across campus. not just faculty, but staff, students, everybody on campus, and also figure out what is the institutional support that can be given to faculty. Like I said, it's not part of the traditional reward structure. So how do you include that and mainstream it? So I just wanted to conclude by saying that we often talk about the need for college-ready students. And I think student success is a shared responsibility. I think we have to figure out how to be a student-ready institution. And part of that is also to personalize our experience from a relationship perspective. The picture that you see is one of our students, Zach, 2 days before graduation, actually had an emergency appendectomy, and our executive director for student life, she came and said, of course, the first generation student, the whole family is crushed. They can't go for graduation. So, and thanks to Laurie, we actually ended up taking the graduation to an abbreviated version, of course, and had it by his bedside in the hospital. But I think it's important because I think we have to personalize these experiences ourselves. So that ends my presentation, and happy to start some discussion. Thank you. Questions?
I'll get it started.
Go ahead.
Mark Gumbel, I'm one of the Assistant Vice Presidents of Student Development and Enrollment Services. And curious, what is it about UCF that interests you in this position at this point in your career?
Well, that's a great question. We've been talking about that this morning as well. And I think that for me, from my perspective, so I've served two successful terms as dean in the College of Business. And one of the things I've thought about is what is next. And I don't know the answer to that. But when I did see the position description, I thought it was very interesting because this position talks about student success and talks about student experiences. And a lot of what I've been doing the last 10 years is based on that. So I see this as a great opportunity. I think the fact that it's very strategic to UCF, the need to maintain your performance and preeminence metrics, and it has a direct financial impact on the institution, that attracted me for the position as well. Yeah, sorry, Wayne, and then.
You mentioned some of the challenges in scaling high-impact practices.
Sure.
What if you had some initial thoughts about what at UCF might be some initial areas where we could do it successfully?
Sure. Yeah. I think that and I'm sort of going back to a previous discussion, but I think one of the challenges with high-impact practices is that we talked about undergraduate research, and I know that one of the colleges, you created a student research mentoring program, right? And I think that you can certainly do that, but I think the bigger question is, what are your metrics, right? How many high-impact practices do you want to focus on, and how many students do you want to have complete these high-impact practices? I think that it's not very easy to scale everything, but I think between what is offered by the Division of Teaching and Learning, like for example, internships, maybe a first-year experience. So if one of our metrics was every student who goes through UCF has to complete at least 2 high-impact practices, I think it would be ultimately a shared load between the Division of Teaching and Learning and the college. And also it's up to each college to decide what kind of high-impact practices they need. So it might be that if they might say that some of the colleges might say we're okay with just a GEP refresh high-impact practice, and that's fine. But they may also choose to have a separate course, upper-level course, which has which is a real-world case project or something along those lines. So yeah, it just depends on the college. I think you had a question. Sorry.
Yes, Delane Fries, Student Development Enrollment Services Associate Vice President.
Hi, Delane.
My question was, based upon your research and your time with us so far today, what do you see as your greatest challenge coming to UCF?
Yeah, I think my greatest challenge will be to make sure I don't get lost on campus. Additionally, but from a work standpoint, I think my greatest challenge is going to be managing, I think, the scale. Just to a question which came up earlier, I think that my experience, I think, has given me a set of skills which I can very easily use to work with colleges. But I see this as a position which is very collaborative, which requires this individual to collaborate with deans, administrators from other colleges, and I think that's going to be, so there's going to be a lot of road shows talking to people about why we're doing what we're doing, why student success is important, why it's important to have more faculty get involved in high impact practices, what are the best ways to do that, what is the compromise between having one best practice for the entire institution versus letting colleges pick their own best practices. I think there's a whole host of things. I think that to me is the challenge, and I think that from what I can see in all my conversations, everybody's passionate about student success, but everybody has an opinion on how to do it. And reconciling all that into one strategy, into one coherent strategy, I think is going to be the biggest challenge. I go on.
I wrote down 3 notes about your presentation, and I don't know if you actually said it or it was my interpretation. Let me just read this back and ask you a question. You said faculty participation is critical.
Yes.
Developing a culture of inclusion is important. And then you mentioned incentives and rewards. And so my question is, what are those incentives and rewards that you discuss as you develop this culture of inclusion and including faculty as critical pieces in that, moving towards student success?
Yeah, I think that there's got to be some recognition of participating in these kinds of activities. That's one of the things, that's what I meant by that. Clearly, in terms of the ability to provide resources, and maybe that comes from the Center for Teaching and Learning, or even through the, I think it's called the Quality Enhancement Program. I think those are the kinds of resources that we have to put on place over there, because I think it's going to be very hard-pressed for faculty to just jump in and develop their own. And I know that you're doing a lot of those things. So you've got these, I think it's called teaching squares or 4 squares or something like that. And so getting faculty to collaborate with other faculty from other colleges, I think, and let the innovation emerge. I don't think the idea is necessarily that I would come and say this is the way to do it. I just want to set it up in such a way that the faculty feel incentivized and feel the need for that kind of an innovation. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. You discussed the importance of getting faculty involved in these high-impact practices. There are several dozen offices on campus with staff that are already involved in trying to promote these high-impact practices. How would you see faculty and staff collaborating to be more effective?
I don't have a direct answer to that. I think clearly, I think depending on what it is, what the high impact practice is. So let's take an example, right? So for example, if we had let's say a directed study program, that's something which you're trying to do as a signature program as a high impact practice. I think the staff helping the faculty from the standpoint of identifying and bringing together other faculty so you can figure out what is the best way to define the goals for something like that is a great example. I think another way to do it is to take a study abroad program. Let's say a faculty member wants to teach a course about Western civilization, and they want to go to Europe for that. Developing the course and developing helping them scope that program, I think would be something the staff could offer in terms of how much it's going to cost and so on. So I see that's a very synergistic relationship. I don't think necessarily those are 2 separate individuals. I think a lot of even within the Division of Teaching and Learning, you've got a lot of units which have staff who are tasked with the idea of bringing together students. So if you have a high impact practice, I think certainly the staff can help attract students to that program. Thank you. Hi.
Hi, I'm Kim Schneider with Undergraduate Research.
Hi, Kim.
My question's a little bit broader, though. You showed a lot of things on a lot of programs or initiatives set up for retention in your college. Can you talk about something that you tried that didn't work, and maybe what you learned from that?
Sure. Actually, I think one of the things that we tried to start a center for data science, a university-wide center for data science, and I was initially tasked with the idea of bringing that to campus and pushing that through. That was a disaster. I mean, it was just completely didn't work at all. So, yeah, and then there were other initiatives we tried to do. For example, we wanted to do a summer bridge program to help remedial students. That didn't work either. It wasn't approved all the way. So, yeah, I mean, I think you kind of pick up the lessons you can learn from some of these experiences and move forward. I mean, that's all I can say. I think the challenge a lot of these initiatives is that they're not easily quantifiable. So we've had a lot of people who question the value of study abroad, right? It's not quantifiable, but by the same token, that it's a great development thing for students. I would submit that the same thing is true for undergraduate research, And I think the challenge is, even for this person who's coming in this position, is to sell these programs internally and externally. To faculty as well as to students. So there's a lot of, so people understand the real impact of some of these programs. Other questions? Hi.
Hi, Brian Boyd, University Registrar.
Hi, Brian.
Happy to be here. The university is going through transition. The division that this position will be leading is going through a little bit of transition as well. Just wondering if you could speak a little bit to your leadership and style and approach to taking a group through a transition like that.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll talk a little bit about, just from my own perspective, my value systems. I think one thing I really try to see is how does it benefit students? I think to me that's a very critical way to evaluate for my campus at least. If it benefits students, it's an easier decision. If it doesn't, then we need to drill down and figure out why we're doing what we're doing. I think the second thing is really trying to be much more collaborative and transparent. I think from a change management perspective, I think there are two things which are very critical. Number one is you have to have strategy, and you have to be able to show the vision for where you want to take the unit or the division down the road, and you have to be able to communicate that. So I think that's very, very critical. I think the second element is communication. So communicating before, during, and after, those are both critical elements. I think there's a lot of resistance typically because people are not sure what to expect. I think demonstrating that this is at least showing them the road, the path to where you want to go, and ultimately how that aligns to your overall organizational goals. So for example, if you're talking about the division of teaching and learning, I think thinking in terms of what are these metrics that you want to focus on, by reorganizing or whatever it is, how does that change the metrics? How does that help us better address the metrics? How does that help us become, at least enhance our ability to meet the goals, whether it is a graduation rate or a retention rate?
Thanks.
You're welcome. Other questions? Well, let me just say something in closing, unless there's some other questions, that it's been a real pleasure being here, coming to UCF. I've learned a lot about your institution in the last 6 hours. How's that? Okay. Very excited to be here. Looking forward to obviously talking some more, discussing with a couple of other groups. But one thing I did notice is that across the board, everybody is passionate about student success. And that speaks very well for your institution. So thank you for coming today, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.